What you gotta do is beat the machine. Try to hit selected targets to increase your score. Put the ball through numbered or lettered sequence lanes to advance bonus, or to light up selected thumper bumpers. You can beat this game on points, by lighting the special, or by matching. But remember, you've got to keep the ball in play or... Okay, you drained. You've got 4 more balls left, so let's go. There's something magical about an arcade. The sights, the sounds, the atmosphere, and of course, the machines. At places like this, we've all played the game. It is enjoyed by everyone. This pure American form of recreation has fascinated, challenged, and entertained millions around the world. It has inspired movies, Broadway plays, and even hit rock and roll records. Today's pinball designers can take you virtually anywhere you want to go. Back in time to experience an authentic 1950s drive-in, complete with your favorite creature feature. To an awe-inspiring theater of magic.
Welcome to the Theater of Magic.
With a spinning magic trunk and levitating balls. To a futuristic carnival where you're taunted by a maniacal talking puppet who wants to keep you out of his funhouse. Or even on a mission into space. Pinball has served as a consistent barometer of our modern-day pop culture. It has been influenced by our fashions, our favorite leisure activities, Hollywood, popular television shows, sports, and our music. What used to be simple to manufacture now requires teams of designers, artists, engineers, assemblers, and composers to create a game that continues to capture the imagination of its players. But it wasn't always this way. In the English countryside around the turn of the 17th century, a game called 9 Holes was gaining popularity. 9 Holes was played outdoors, where players would roll 6 balls into various scoring holes dug into the ground. Soon, the French introduced a cue stick and brought the game indoors. The French called this indoor 9 Holes game bagatelle. The difference between bagatelle and its English predecessor 9 Holes was the introduction of wooden pegs located around the various scoring holes at the top of the playing board. By the late 1700s, bagatelle had become quite popular throughout Europe. But how would this unique game make its way across the Atlantic to America?
In a way, pinball really started with the American Revolution. And how do you make a connection like that? Well, the French came over and brought their game of bagatelle, which was a marble game. The French were allied with us during the American Revolution. The American officers played with the French officers. They picked up the game, and bagatelle became the American Army game.
Charles Dickens even makes mention of these amusing games in his 1836 novel, The Pickwick Papers. By the mid-1800s, the wooden pegs on the playing field were being replaced by brass pins, which eventually gave birth to the name pinball. Bagatelle was very popular throughout the United States during the mid-1800s. This political cartoon depicts Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet playing a leisurely game of bagatelle. Meanwhile, the English had come up with their own unique version of bagatelle, and it was called cockamaroo. The significance of this English gambling game was the introduction of shooting lanes on the far left and far right sides of the board. Another interesting aspect of Cockamaroo was the use of immediate on-site scoring capabilities through the use of these scoring troughs. In America, a game called Tivoli became the Americanized bagatelle board. The popularity of Tivoli grew fast, and in no time at all, it was popping up in barrooms and saloons across America. By the 1860s and 70s, as saloons and gambling parlors began to sprout up across the United States, American inventors, manufacturers, and game makers were entering the gaming market at an astounding pace. Meanwhile, with its dual-channel ball introduction lanes, pins, pegs, and scoring troughs, Tivoli would remain popular in the U.S. until the early 1900s. One of the single most important patents in pinball's history was issued to Montague Redgrave of Cincinnati, Ohio. His invention, the ball shooter, known today as the plunger. Redgrave has been called the father of American pinball, and this is his game, improvements in bagatelle. Montague Redgrave would never realize the true significance of his invention, for what he had created was the first true pinball machine.
Montague Redgrave came here in 1871, took the bagatelle game, and took a brand new technology, the ability to wrap a steel wire into a spring. He put that spring on the end of a shooter, put the shooter on the game, and that's precisely the same shooter we have today in pinball.
Redgrave's wonderful new game, with its bells and spring-loaded plunger, was very popular indeed. Redgrave's game did very well in the gaming market from the 1880s until the early 1900s. Almost everything in the world of coin-operated games and arcade devices seemed to be coming out of Chicago around the turn of the century.
When you're talking about the industrial age, it had to be Chicago because it had tremendous labor pool. In the year 1905, only 1 out of 10 Chicagoans were native-born Americans. And these were people that came from Europe with talents and skills. They'd worked in machine shops. They knew what was going on, and so they helped the city industrialize, and that was the labor pool that led to the coin machine industry.
Of the two Cale brothers, Arthur was the natural salesman and promoter. His brother Adolph was the tinkerer. Together they would play a very important role in pinball's history with this game called Log Cabin. This sturdy, well-made game was aggressively marketed throughout the U.S. and was seen on hundreds of saloon counters and barrooms across the country in the early 1900s. Each game was loaded with 250 steel balls. When the coin was dropped into the slot, the handle could be turned to place the ball into the side alley to then be shot onto the playing field. This is believed to be the first photograph ever taken of a pinball machine in the field. It was shot around 1900. The game at the end of the bar is Log Cabin.
As you get into pinball history, you're going to hear about Harry Williams. But there's another Harry that you haven't heard about yet. And his name was Harry Reid, and he came from Salem, Massachusetts. What did Harry do? Well, in the early 1900s, he took a folding bagatelle board that he took to carnivals and fairs, electrified it, put light bulbs in a big flat thing in the back, and red, white, and blue lights, and as you scored, those lights would flash on and off. That was the beginning of a flashing backblast.
Unfortunately, Reid would never realize the true significance of his ingenious accomplishment. In one move, he had introduced electricity and the backlash to pinball. The demands of the First World War curtailed innovations and significant manufacturing efforts in the pinball business. A similar manufacturing halt of pin games would happen again some 30 years later in World War II. But another unexpected blow had also come to pinball in the 1920s: Prohibition. With the loss of this nation's 225,000 saloons and barrooms, all of the coin-operated game industry suffered. To make matters worse, the budding motion picture industry was pulling people out of the penny arcades and into the theaters. Despite the initial bad news of the early 1920s, some very important changes were just around the corner for pinball. This game is called Wiffle. It was made by these three gentlemen from Youngstown, Ohio.
Art Baldwin was a very depressed guy. He was a farmer in Youngstown, Ohio, and a carpenter. The Depression was on, there was no work, he had a problem. He had a game that his daughter had. It was a little bagatelle game. He took it to a local drugstore, And so did to a bunch of his buddies there. And they said, you know, if we put a coin mechanism in this thing, we'd make a lot of money. And that led to the pinball game called Wiffle.
Soon, Wiffle was a national phenomenon, and Automatic Industries Incorporated became the first factory in the world solely dedicated to pinball. Ironically, pinball's first wave of mass popularity came at a time when you would least expect it. During the depths of the Great Depression, Americans were out of work and out of hope. People needed an escape, and for only a penny, you could play your troubles away. In the late 1920s, a young entrepreneur named David Gottlieb was traveling the American Southwest. As a distributor of punch cards and test-your-grip machines, he realized the opportunities available in the budding coin-operated amusements industry. David Gottlieb was about to make pinball history. In 1931, Gottlieb introduced a machine that would generate a wave of excitement that is still felt to this day. Baffle Ball was the world's first mass-produced and mass-marketed pinball machine. And David Gottlieb was about to become a very wealthy young man.
Well, Baffle Ball was offered for sale in 1931 for a cost of $17.50. And you get 7 balls for 1 penny, and some distributors purchased the game and put it out. And after one weekend, they realized with more than $17.50 in the cash box, the game has paid for itself in a couple of days. So consequently, the demand became significant for the game, and they built over 60,000 of them.
Ray Maloney worked for a small game distribution company called Line Manufacturing. Due to the demand for his game, Gottlieb would turn to Line Manufacturing to serve as one of the many distributors of Baffle Ball. When Ray Maloney took a look at Gottlieb's wonderful machine, he saw a unique opportunity for wealth and fortune. Dick Fuchsell explains.
One of the really great geniuses in pinball was a marketing guy, and his name was Ray Maloney. And he sold punch boards and things like that. He was a distributor for games. So he was a distributor for Baffle Ball. But Gottlieb was so behind in orders, he couldn't get delivery. So he said, I'm going to make my own game. So what he did is he took a game, somebody brought it to him, he took the cover of a magazine called Ballyhoo, which had a big harlequin design, put the design on the game, put the name on the game, took the thing to the show, built a big booth, and you've got to remember now that most of the people that were in the business were veterans of World War I. So he took the tune of Mademoiselle from Armentières and said, what'll they play in 32 Ballyhoo? What'll they play in 32 Ballyhoo? He named his company after it, Bally.
40 years later, his company name would be mentioned on a hit rock and roll song by The Who from the rock opera Tommy. Soon, Bally was surpassing Gottlieb with over $1 million in annual sales. Pinball was spreading like wildfire across the country. In 1933 alone, there were well over 75 companies manufacturing pinball games. During the early 1930s, playing balls changed from marbles, which were prone to chipping, to the steel ball bearings that we still use today. The first boom era of pinball was from around 1930 to 1934. During those years, most all of the games maintained the simple bagatelle format, a plunger or shooter handle, and a variety of holes surrounded by pins on a slanted board. While the majority of the new pinball games were coming out of Chicago in the early 1930s, an independent game designer named Harry Williams in Southern California was working on new ways of reintroducing electricity to pinball.
For the very first time, Harry Williams came out with a game called Contact. Battery powered. It not only allowed the player to see how a ball was able to be kicked out of a hole using a plunger on a solenoid that kicked the ball out. Secondly, it had a lighting effect on the game. And third, it did another thing which was not done up to that time. It had sound effect in the game, which gave a little ringing bell when you accomplished something.
Pinball was suddenly a fast-moving action game, and Contact was a smash hit. Harry and his partner, Fred McClellan, could hardly keep up with the public's demand. Soon, all of the other manufacturers were utilizing the mighty electrical solenoids to propel the balls on the playing field. This spelled the end for the old gravity-controlled machines. When Williams introduced the bells to contact, he soon realized that players demanded sound. In fact, 3 times as many players were plunking their coins into the contact game as opposed to the silent games. Production in the pinball industry was at an all-time high. By 1934, thousands of new electronic machines were being produced by close to 100 different manufacturers. Williams, who would go on to become one of pinball's greatest designers, brought many important innovations to the game, including the pedestal tilt.
He came up with a little pedestal that you had a little ball, small ball, placed on the top of this pedestal. And as you put in your coin, the pedestal came up, the ball was sitting there on top of this pedestal. One day Harry walked into the location watching them playing his game with that little pedestal and the ball on top. And he listened to them playing, and then all of a sudden he heard somebody yell, "Hey, he tilted the game!" The ball fell off. And from that day on, he used the name tilt.
The pedestal tilt later evolved into the pendulum tilt, which is still in use today. Williams also invented the free game wheel, which would reward the player with a replay or a credit as opposed to a monetary payout, thus creating the industry term for amusement only. Harry Williams' expertise in the new and exciting world of pinball was making him renowned in his field. David Roccola, known by most people today because of his success in the jukebox industry, was intrigued by the popularity of pinball. Roccola wanted in, so he recruited none other than the pinball maverick Harry Williams to be the chief designer at the new Roccola pinball division. When Williams joined hands with Roccola, their pinball business quickly flourished. This game we see here is the most well-known and most popular of the Roccola pinball line. It was called Jigsaw. Thousands of these games were manufactured by Roccola. They pulled in big revenues, probably due to the fact that a map of San Francisco at around the time of 1935 would jigsaw into place as various scoring holes on the playing field were attained. In the mid-1930s, there were close to 50 different pinball manufacturing companies in America. The marketing of games was booming, and the competition was intense. But most of these companies would not survive. Another new innovation that came to pinball in the 1930s was the more prevalent utilization of the backglass as a way of showing score tallies, and also to display colorful and artistic motifs which would reflect whatever was popular at the time the game was made. The first backglasses were small, but soon would grow in size, giving the backglass artists more space to create and giving the players more to look at. In 1937, Bally introduced a new game called Bumper. Up until Bumper, scoring was primarily achieved by balls falling into the various scoring holes on the playing field. Not so on Bumper. When the ball would make contact with these electrified springs, points were awarded instantly, and better yet, your ball was still in play, a significant achievement for pinball.
Just before World War II, there must have been anywhere from 12, 15, 18 companies producing pin games. And what happened is, every company that was in existence at that time had a quantity of materials available to make games. So when the World War II broke out, all manufacturers could use only the materials that were at that time in their possession and could not buy any additional materials like silver, copper, bronze, and additional materials that were really required, or wire that was required for their games.
Most pinball companies involved in the war effort received lucrative government contracts. These same companies continued to make games after the war. Williams was no exception.
The first game that Harry Williams produced as a production game was in February of 1946, called Suspense.
So, by 1946, the stage was set. The major players that would hold dominance for the next 30 years were in place. Williams Manufacturing, D. Gottlieb and Company, and Bally.